First of all, thank you all. It's wonderful to be around, or rather to be speaking virtually with so many like-minded people. I always lived in that gap, and I tried to cover the gap by essentially having too many majors and by sort of studying everything that I could, but there was a way in which it pulled on me in many directions at once, and I wish I was just allowed to live in my like gap of unknowing and curiosity when I was in undergrad, and when I was in grad school also. But it sounds like that's what you're doing, allowing people to live in that uncertainty and that unknowing and just the complexity of the world and the way it is. And I think that's sort of the only way to look at the world. My background is it's a bit strange. I was born in Ohio. I'm going to go way back, and there's a reason why I'm going to go way back. I promise. I was born in Ohio on a farm, and I come from a long line of blue collar workers and farmers, and no scientists, no writers, no artists. But they always told stories to one another, and their way of looking at the world was never narrow. It was wonderfully complex. It really truly was. Um, they believed in science. They used genetics when they were breeding cows and things like that. They had to understand climate. They had to understand the weather and all of these greater patterns of the world. And the way I got into science is my father used to tell me stories. I didn't get into it in like a pure way, in that I was interested in just like math from a very early age, or that people showed me equations and I thought that was super cool and I want to do physics. It was through stories. And I kind of think that because I was just told stories about the world and about Albert Einstein and things like that when I was a kid, that I always wanted to tell stories and I always wanted to just like talk about the world generally. Um, when I went to school, I couldn't decide on what I actually wanted to do. So I studied both physics and literature. And I, in particular, studied Spanish literature, because growing up on a farm, I had learned Spanish at a very early age. I learned very quickly that my farm Spanish was quite different from Baroque and Renaissance Spanish that I was reading in college, and that it was essentially another language that I had to learn. But it was lovely. I loved my literature classes, and I loved the way we discussed literature, because in my physics classes, we didn't discuss physics. You did physics. It was a thing that you did. It was equations that you had to solve. It was problem sets that you had to do. And I never understood that way of doing science. I wanted to talk about things. It turns out I was actually interested in the philosophy and history of physics and its claims to knowledge, and not so much just the rote knowledge that I was being taught itself. Um, I didn't know that you could do philosophy of science when I started out. This is comes from my sort of farm boy background and being one of the first in my family to go to college. I think if I had known that, I wouldn't have done physics. I would have done philosophy or history of science. But I got to learn a lot of physics. I got to learn a lot about the sort of claims to knowledge, that physics has. I even got to try to do a lot of physics, especially while I was at McGill and doing a my graduate work, and realized very quickly that I was no good at physics, but I was really good at sort of working toward understanding it, and working toward like its stories and the stories that it shares with people, and I guess like making my own stories about physics. Um, so I dropped out of my PhD at McGill. I moved to New York. I slept on couches and I tried to become a writer in a very cliched way, in Brooklyn. And I was sort of successful. I am currently a writer and sort of walked back through the back door of academia and now teach about literature and science at the University of Texas. And I write. I, in particular, am writing a very long and exhausting and exhaustive book about the history of physics, and in particular, the sort of cultural history of physics, all the ways in which physics intersects with the larger world, with arts, with I don't know everything, with technology, with economies, with democracy, with fascism, with all of these things. That last one's particularly topical, unfortunately, at the moment here in the United States where I am. Um, but so that's how I sort of became me, or that sort of, I guess, describes me. Um, uh, Now about this piece and sort of where it came from. So when I was an undergrad, I was tasked with doing a thesis. I went to a big university in the Midwest in the United States, and one of these big universities that have like 50,000 people. But I was really lucky in that I was part of a very small college within this giant university, one that you learned the sciences, but you learned them essentially through you learned all of the sciences at once, but you were required to take a large number of humanities courses. It was like a general sort of like we are scientists, but we also need you to learn the humanities, which is partly why I did physics. I mean, Spanish literature. It was a very, very small college within this big university, and I had to do a thesis that combined the humanities with physics. And so from a very, I guess, when I was an undergrad, I I had to think about the ways in which literature intersected with physics or science in general. And I I think I was never quite clear about realism and what people meant by realism in science and philosophy and in literature. And that debate always, I don't know why it mystified me, but it always mystified me. And in reading Spanish literature, in particular Borges, and on the exactitude in science, like the map is not the terrain itself. It is a representation of the terrain. Language is not a thing itself. Science is not nature itself. Math is not the world itself. We deal in abstractions all the time, and I was always interested in the way we deal with abstractions in literature and in science, and how these abstractions are essentially our way of trying to figure out about the world. It's how we try to know and understand things. We're always trying to go from unknowing toward knowing. And physics taught me something really important. It taught me about uncertainty and that there was always going to be uncertainty there. Um, and math, when I studied math, it taught me about incompleteness, the incompleteness of math itself. Mathematicians know the incompleteness of itself. And when I was when I was trying to become a writer and when I was thinking about writing, I don't know, maybe this is my own arrogance or something. I don't know what it was, but I never thought about the incompleteness of language. That I always thought of myself as writing toward some sort of complete understanding of something. And I realized that I was doing it wrong and that hadn't actually learned from my science background. That I would always be writing toward knowing something, but I wouldn't actually ever completely know something. And I needed to understand the way we do experiments to sort of, I guess, go toward knowing, but to realize that we're always going to sit in unknowing. And it's just where we are always going to be. Um, Now, this piece itself, I actually wrote this 4 years ago. So I haven't. I wrote it a very long time ago. I had this idea. I was thinking one day about when I was an undergrad and just sitting in lab and I was actually doing experiments and then how I would go like the very next hour over to my Spanish literature course and we would talk about experiments and what it meant to experiment in literature. And I had never really, I don't think I thought about it at the time, but how we were talking about experiments in both, but we weren't necessarily talking about the same thing, or at least in the way we were describing it, we weren't sort of talking about the same thing. And so I wanted to understand what experiments were in both literature and in physics. So started thinking back to the things that I read. At the time, I started thinking back toward my old thesis, and I just started writing. I ended up doing a lot of reading that I probably should have done when I was an undergrad and never did, and remembering a lot of things that I had completely forgotten, including some of my own writing, which was quite embarrassing. Um, and this is sort of the piece that came out of it, or this was just my thinking as I went through and read all of these things that I probably should have read before, as I was reading all of the things that I had written before, as I was rereading some of the things that I had read as an undergrad. Um, and sort of as I was going through and doing that reading, I discovered um, this guy named Agustin Fernandez Mayo. And I realized that he was essentially who I always wanted to be. He was a physicist who became a fiction writer and who used his training in physics to think about the nature of fiction itself and to think about the way he writes fiction and the way it actually, I mean, from how it appears on the page to what he actually writes about and the way things connect in his fiction. And I got hooked. I just started reading everything I could by this guy named Mayo. Um, and he's very much an experimental writer, and he has a background in experimental physics, and he's trying to understand the world. He actually even came up with this theory of how to understand the world through, I guess, his experimentation in physics and applying it to his ideas to fiction. Well, in particular to poetry at first, and also to fiction. Um, and basically how we make sense of the world and how we make sense of the world through these different subject areas. And I think he was onto something, or at least when I was reading it, I was like, this is what I always wanted. So as I was writing, I was always writing toward this guy Mayo. Um, I will say, I thought a lot about what physics meant to me and the way he describes physics. And physics to me was always about the possibilities of the world. Um, Physicists, they don't just describe the world. And any physicist who tells you that they're just looking at an electron the way it is, that's not true. What they are is they are manipulating things and they are trying to enumerate all of the possibilities of reality, whatever that means, of these actual objects that are out in the world. They're trying to put them through their paces, essentially, put them in different scenarios, manipulate them until essentially they cannot manipulate them anymore, push the limits of all that is possible. And it seemed to me that Maya was doing something similar in his writing. He was pushing the limits of what was possible, but he was pushing them into the impossible. He was describing things that were absolutely not possible, or I couldn't see as being possible in the real world. Um, and it made me think about like, is that what fiction is? Is fiction just like that moment where we take over and we use the impossible to understand what is possible in greater relief? Is that what it is? Is it something that's essentially like a superstructure or a supra framework by which we try to understand the world? I, these were sort of my incoherent thoughts, as they are a little bit incoherent still. And I just always wanted to know, or I wanted to sort of think about the way we ask questions about the world. And it just always struck me that experiments themselves were questions. And we came to some sort of understanding um, in the experiments we did in fiction and the experiments we do in science and things like that. But that essentially asking questions, you just elicit more questions. And that's why there's no end to experiments. That's why we're never going to exhaust science. We're never going to exhaust fiction. We're never going to exhaust these things. Um, we can know more and more, we can understand more and more, but we're never going to eliminate our unknowing, essentially. We're never going to know it all. I mean, I always thought I was going to know it all. I don't know. I guess that was just me when I was a kid. But I'm definitely not a know-it-all anymore, and not a person who believes that anyone is a know-it-all. Um, I'm happy to talk more about like how I actually wrote the piece. I just wanted to give you some of my like thoughts going into the piece, some of the things that like I was thinking about while I was writing the piece, basically just some of the like itches that I needed to scratch when I was going through. Because whenever I write, that's essentially what I'm writing from. It's an itch. It's something I don't know. It's something that bothers me. It's something that I need to try to understand, and I never understand it in the end. But I come to some place where I have essentially exhausted that question and I just have more questions. And then I feel that I am done. Basically, that's the only way I know that I'm done with something. I didn't write anything down. I just sort of like had these thoughts. I was out running and I was had having these thoughts and I was trying to dictate them to myself while I was running, and then I was listening to them and they made no sense. And so this is what I essentially came up with. But I am happy to answer any questions that you have, talk about anything that you would like to talk about further.
Oh, we have so many questions, I'm sure. Thank you. Don't worry about it. That's the way we work here too.
Yeah.
Like, okay, let's think about it. We have 3 minutes and let's move and ask questions now. Exactly. It was a great talk, Joshua. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I have plenty of questions, but I'm sure you guys have too. So who wants to start? Why don't we ask the physicist to start?
Honestly, I actually wrote down some of the lines of things that you were saying. I mean, the very last thing that I wrote was, you write when you don't know something, it's an itch, something that you need to understand. And to be honest, I've always found writing a bit painful because it's that something that you have inside and you're trying to express it in this way with words. And so you have to keep trying and trying. And I just thought that if I could reframe the intentionality of writing as seeking to understand, like the act itself is figuring something out, it could almost make it pleasurable. So I really like that last thing that you just said.
Yes, as someone who writes, I will say that it is not always pleasurable to me, but the thinking through a problem is always pleasurable to me. And I use all the tricks that I can to force myself to write. And it's sort of, yeah, the great secret, I think, of writing and of writers is that even they have trouble. And it is hard. But there's just like you push through because you have these questions.
Why not, to scratch the hitch, Joshua? Why not use physics?
It's a really good question. I thought that the questions that I had about the world and the ones that really perplexed me were going to be answered through physics. And I tried. Um, and it turns out that in doing physics, in doing math, that the questions that I actually had were about the nature of physics itself and about the nature of reality itself, the nature of how we actually know anything, how we have connections to nature, um, what it all means. I think I was asking, or I wanted to ask deeper questions than physics itself gets at. I think I don't want to say that physics does ask very deep questions, very, very deep questions. I think that I wanted to push even further than what was possible. Um, just like what was possible out there in the world. I wanted to just understand essentially like the humanity of it, how humans interact with physical objects and understand physical objects. And I didn't just want to understand the physical objects themselves. Um, there is a place for that in physics, but I was not in that place when I was studying physics, basically.
Okay. Yes.
So I've taken two essentially philosophy of physics courses that are about realism and anti-realism, and just exploring the idea of anti-realism after like 4 years of studying physics. And like I was in a physics program in high school, so coming from like physics and law, you've got to learn those equations and how they relate to each other, to then being told it's all just our best guess. Did that realization change the way you perceive like folklore and how like other cultures like explained the natural world through stories and metaphor? And then like, because like it made me realize that physics is just one metaphor that is just now currently accepted to be the truth or accepted to be the most practical for our current goals. So yeah.
Absolutely. So, for instance, I think physics is very good at compression. Um, what physicists do incredibly well is narrow down the question until they can answer it. And they have the spherical cow. They make all of these approximations until they can answer a question, but they aren't living with the cow itself, basically, and they aren't studying the cow itself. That is left to other domains and other disciplines. There is a writer who I avoided for the longest time, and I shouldn't have. And when I finally read this writer, it opened up so many things to me. The writer is Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she wrote this book called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's a series of essays about indigenous knowledge. She is an indigenous writer with a background in biology, and she essentially writes about other ways of knowing about the world. And this deep history that indigenous societies have through just living in the world, interacting with the world, being in nature, and living with nature. She has these ideas of reciprocity that she talks about how indigenous cultures and practices they they believe that we get from nature what we give essentially to nature. And so the knowledge that they get from nature is through the gifts that they also give to nature and the way that they actually go about interacting with the world. And she tells these incredible stories of of knowledge that has been essentially gained through these practices. And it changed the way I look at the world. And it changed the way I look at the world from just I want to understand nature. I'm going to extract my knowledge from nature rather than I am going to co-create my knowledge with nature. And I am going to understand that these stories that I am trying to tell about the natural world are essentially being authored with the natural world in a way of speaking. So I very much have thought about have thought about this. There's another writer who I really like who also thinks about this quite a lot. Her name is Chanda Prescott Weinstein. She is an astrophysicist here in the U.S., but she speaks all the time about different ways of knowing about the world outside of her discipline. And she's wonderful, wonderful essayist.
Okay, wait, let's go around the table before we get more than one session.
Thanks so much for that essay. I really enjoyed it, and it was so thought-provoking.
Session.
And
Maybe look at the camera. Okay, he's seeing the back of your
yeah,
head.
sorry, it's so.
Maybe look here.
and
Oh,
it's-
I'm seeing both. Yeah, okay.
Okay. And there are still a lot of things I'm still contemplating with myself, so I don't have clear questions on that. But you did mention that you were working on a kind of history of physics and knowledge, and you also started with a personal narrative, which is a kind of a plausible story as to how some things connect when we look back in time to kind of our own personal experiences. And we end up selecting bits and pieces to make sense of the present moment and how things kind of come together. I guess that's a particular way of knowing the world and making sense of it too. You also talked about questions. You talked a lot about questions, and I do see that we talk a lot about questions in modern sciences. A good question, a PhD starts with a question. As students of science and as disciples of this kind of spaces, we have to ask good questions and so on and so forth. And then you talked about different ways of knowing the world and some other different systems maybe of knowledge production and knowledge consumption and knowledge generation in a way. And I've just been wondering for myself, all of these years immersed in Western science, what type of knowing subject is the current Western influenced subject? What is it? Like, it seems to have a bit of, sorry, I don't want to answer a question I'm asking you, but it just seems to me that.
Go ahead if you can, go ahead. You know.
It's just my first thought as I walked into these spaces and embedded them with my body and my question, my mind, is that it's a bit of an immodest type of knowledge seeker in a way. And it leaves space for uncertainty, but still with the type of arrogance of the knowable and the explainable. And sorry, I'm rumbling now, but yeah, you see where I'm coming from with that.
Yeah. So the way that I started by telling the personal story, there's a way of describing this in history. It's called a rational reconstruction. I am after the fact rationalizing it or basically coming up with an explanation for why I am the way I am. But it is almost certainly not exactly true. But it is my way of understanding essentially where I come from, given where I started in life. I am a farm boy and grew up among fields, and now I have books behind me. It's very different than where I'm from. The ways of knowing, science. I had this conversation actually yesterday, strangely enough, with a writer from the New York Times who just so happens to be a very good friend of mine. And we talked about how journalists and scientists are very similar in the way they look at the world. And it is sort of to their detriment. They believe that they can be objective and purely objective. And they don't see themselves as actors and makers in the stories that they tell. We don't see ourselves as people in a lab interacting with electrons and changing electrons and manipulating electrons, but rather we see ourselves when we are in science as people who are just observing electrons objectively, wholly outside of the actual systems that we are measuring. Now there are areas of science And there's even quantum mechanics, which allows for observers to do all sorts of funky things when making measurements and stuff like that. But it's always struck me that we aspire toward objectivity, um, but but there's some people who believe we actually reach it wholly, and journalists are one. Unfortunately, sometimes I don't want to be too harsh on journalists. I like journalists. There's some very good journalists out there, and I don't want to be harsh. I like science. I like scientists. I like the way they do things. But I think we have to limit ourselves in how we actually. Um, I think we have to be more humble in the way that we talk about these things. That there's always a place for unknowing. There's always a place for us and our thoughts as we are going through and trying to understand something and trying to tell a story, that we are actors in the stories that we are telling, no matter how objective we are trying to be. Um, that doesn't mean that everything has to be a personal narrative. That doesn't mean that everything in science is completely subjective and up to the observer. There are ways in which different people can perceive the world and ways in which those perceptions and our interpretations of the world can mesh and can overlap with one another, and we can find agreement with each other. It's not all individual perceptions. There is a sort of, I think what it is we lack a community, is what I'm trying to say. And we need a community of understanding. We need to realize that we are all part of a knowledge community. We're all part of a storytelling community, and that we gather knowledge together, and no one person is objective and no one scientist is objective. No one story we tell is the only one, but rather we need to tell all kinds of stories to essentially surround reality, truth, not with a capital T maybe, but something like that. Yes.
Who's Irene, Devashi, and
This is for her. If you're interested in psychology, you should read Ian Hacking.
okay, who's
Cool. Thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I don't have a physics related question because I hate physics, but I come from like a interdisciplinary background, like a lot of people here. And you talk about your background as well being very interdisciplinary, so coming from the physics and literature background. And then I guess as you're kind of progressing through academia, the common, I guess, thing is that you specialize into some sort of knowledge. And your PhD topic is usually a very like niche specialized thing. I was wondering how your views on the value of being a generalist versus being a specialist have changed as you've gone from your undergrad to your master's to your PhD and now.
Yes. Great question. There was a reason why I didn't finish my PhD in physics, and it was essentially because I could not confine myself to the subject at hand. I found it near impossible. I was spending far too much time outside of Rutherford Hall, and I was in libraries and I was in cafes and I was reading all of the things that I probably shouldn't have been reading, but that I felt compelled to read anyways. But I will say this. I think, strangely enough, my rather narrow background, well, I mean, I have a background in literature too, but I think that my study of physics helped me in interesting ways as a writer, and in particular, like pushing myself to do physics, which wasn't this thing that came naturally to me. It's just where I thought all of my questions were. And the methods that it actually taught me have ended up being very useful generally, even though they were applied in this very specific area. I do not do physics today. I don't do it. I am not sitting here and I'm not deriving equations in the way that I used to. I'm not manipulating any electrons other than those right here on my computer. I'm not, that's not what I do. But the way in which I used to try to do that and the way in which I tried to do math, I did it through compression, as I mentioned before. Physics is all about compression. It's about trying to reach what is important in a problem. And what is most important in a problem, I, I guess finding out what is most important and then trying to solve it. So you're simplifying, 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 simplifying. Um, I do this whenever I try to understand something. I'm trying to get to the root of something. I'm trying to find out what's important in it, and I'm trying to understand it through the most important part. And then I can expand out from there. Um, I think the specified knowledge that I have from my study of physics basically trained me in a different way that writers are than most writers are trained, and allows me to be different from most writers, and allows me to look at the world differently from most writers, and possibly even just like yeah, just like write differently, I think. Because as I'm going through, I'm always, I don't know, I'm solving for X. I don't know. It's just like a math equation or something. I don't know. I'm not sure. Um, I I like I like specified knowledge. I like people who push and push and push and who scratch and scratch and scratch at one question their entire lives. I really truly appreciate that. It just wasn't me. And I had I don't know, I just I'm a dog and I see a new thing and I want to understand that thing. I have a new question over here. I want to understand that thing. I used to worry all the time because where I'm from, there's a phrase, and fortunately, people used to say it about me all the time. They call people jack of all trades, master of none, and I felt like I was the master of nothing. That I read too widely and I just never mastered anything. And I learned that you can't really be the master of anything. You can always just keep asking questions. And I don't see what's wrong with asking questions widely. And I don't see what's wrong with asking questions specifically either, as long as you are asking questions.
You are among your people here at Joshua.
Sounds like it, yeah.
I think we all feel that way. I think you spoke to Anita a lot. Irene,
Hi. I unfortunately wasn't able to come for all of your talk, but I was standing at the door, but I read your article and it was incredibly
Thank you.
well written, and I came as soon as my class ended. I walked in when you were talking about journalism and objective truth, and I'm with you in that I don't think there is an objective truth. I think there's so much subjectivity, and my question is basically coming from, because you said that you like journalists and you like scientists, and so I had two questions. I was like,
why?
well, do you consider yourself a journalist, a scientist, a writer, or do you impose those things onto your own identity? Is my first question, which is a personal one, and you don't have to answer. And then my second, and then my second one is, do you think, in my lecture earlier today, I was told that decisiveness reassures the public and provides reputability. And I'm wondering if you think that the public will ever be ready to grasp that there isn't an objective truth, because I really am of that camp and I'm with you, and I have issue explaining this sometimes to people where I'm like, guys, there isn't a truth. You're just in a lab and you just think that the cells are doing that, but like we don't actually quite know. And so like I also wanted to hear more about what you were saying, where like there is some objective truth somewhere, like where? Because the radical in me just wants to say, well, nothing is objectively true. But of course, that can be very dangerous territory as Olivier makes faces at me.
Yes.
Really, of course, I understand that. And I was like, I don't really say that out loud to most people. I just kind of write it on a Google Doc that doesn't go anywhere. So I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts, but I guess the two would be: do you confine yourself in terms of like identity and labeling? And then second, do you think the public is ready or will ever, or do you think it's necessary to even illustrate the lack of an objective truth?
Both excellent questions. My identity is also how people identify me, I think. My self-identity is I'm just me. But whenever I'm in different situations, I have to identify myself in different ways because I'm not one thing to all the people, and I don't necessarily fit in all of the places. So to writers, I'm a science writer. Whenever I say I'm a writer, people are always like, "Oh, well, what do you write? Do you write fiction?" I'm like, "No." Do you write just like general nonfiction? Sort of, yeah. Oh, you're a science writer. So they want to label me as just a science writer. I never have thought of myself as that. And in fact, most science writers, if you ask them, I am not a science writer. I'm definitely not a journalist. If when pushed, I just call myself a writer with a physics background, or a literature and physics background. Um, that's all I say. Or if I'm going to get real persnickety, I'm a creative nonfiction writer. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I don't even know what that means. Um, now, oh, decisiveness is the tool of despots. When will we ever understand that we do not understand? Um, I don't know. I worry about this all the time. Science writers actually worry about this in particular all the time because they know when really pushed, if you get a science writer drunk and you start asking them questions, they will admit they are not objective. They will admit science is not objective, yet they will also tell you that they have to write as if, because the public only understands that as if part, that the public only thinks that when we talk about science, we are talking about truth, that science has to be truth, and that we have to talk about things with certainty, and that we can't mention all of the ways in which we actually do science that are going about knowledge and not these direct linear paths, that we are essentially also grasping at straws in the dark, just like everyone else. Um, yeah, politicians are the only people who speak with certainty, and they do this because the public craves it. We all crave it. We all want to know things. We all want to think that there is a way of knowing things. It is comfort. It really, truly is comforting when we think we understand something, when we think we know something, when we think we have something figured out in the world. That's what we all seek. It makes sense. And we are essentially asking people to be uncomfortable. And I don't mind being uncomfortable. I've always felt uncomfortable, so why not just be uncomfortable? It's great. I don't know, maybe that's how I should identify myself. It's just some happy being uncomfortable. Um, but it is it's kind of unfair for us to ask everyone to be uncomfortable. It's also unfair for them to just be so damn comfortable and like seek so much damn comfort when there's so much discomfort in the world. Um, that is a really wishy-washy answer.
That's okay.
In
It's
part
complicated.
because there's no answer.
I think it's a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, but thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
You do.
Hi, so thank you so much for your, should I look here or there?
Or whatever.
Wherever you want to look.
So thank you so much for your insightful talk. You had mentioned in an earlier answer that the way society works influences how a discipline matures. So how do you think physics evolved or developed or is understood by people after the era of continental physics when scientists all around were interacting more freely than they do now? Has it been good, bad, ugly, neutral, chaos?
Like everything, it's both. It's somewhere in between good and bad. There was a time when physics was very small, when it was very chummy, when it was essentially an old white boys club, and that's not necessarily a good thing. It's definitely not always a good thing. But within that, if you were of a certain identity, you were free to ask questions. You didn't have to worry about jobs. You didn't have to worry about institutions, and you didn't have to worry about fitting within disciplines and all of this other thing. There is a way in which you were just asking questions back in the day, in which you were free. And when physics was just becoming what we now call physics, institutionalization brings things. It brings good things and bad things. Some of the good things are with institutions, we can impose diversity of viewpoints. We can ask and invite other people into a club, essentially, than those who are already in the club. We can work together. The way physics is done now actually requires tremendous collaboration. Particle physics today requires thousands of people working in concert. This could not have been done back in the day. It could not have been done when it was this sort of freewheeling, individualistic way of looking at the world. And hey, I have questions, and hey, I'm a genius, and hey, all of these things. No, I think it's great the way physics is done today in this way, in this collaborative, community-led way of seeking knowledge. It also it also means you have to sort of ask the questions that the community wants to ask, that you have to work within the community, that it is sometimes harder to have outside opinions, to live outside the institutions, all of the things that come with a sort of way we look at elitism. That it becomes very easy to discredit things that are perceived as elite. This is part of the problem with science, I think, today in the United States in particular, is that it is perceived as elite. It is perceived as this tool of institutions, as these people who are trying to tell us the way we should think and what our opinions should be, that we aren't entitled to our own opinions and ways of looking at the world, that we aren't entitled to our individual perspectives. But rather we have to sort of subsume ourselves to this community of knowledge and this way of looking at the world. When science institutionalizes, it becomes essentially perceived as an elite institution. I like everything. I think that there has to be something in between and a way of looking at it in between and a way of seeking the in between and getting people to understand both, that we can have individual questions and we can pursue individual questions, but we can also come at things as a community, and we can have communal knowledge, and we can have experts, and they can come together and form consensus, and that we should listen to consensus, even when it goes against our personal way of thinking.
So, Joshua, I had this burning question I wanted to ask after
Yes.
listening to a lot of you.
I don't want it to burn you, please.
It's the itch I need to get the scratch here. I'm going to ramble a bit, but what I'm trying to say is that though it's clear that society, who you are, where you live in society, has an influence on how you see the world, whether there's the way you see experiments. Foucault had mentioned that also, right? As like society influences the way you see the world, which I think is absolutely real.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, not everything is completely, especially in science, completely, I'm not going to say objective because it's not possible, but things do work, right? And what I'm afraid of is the fact when we sort of, everything becomes relative, then it also opens the door to abuses on things that we know are,
Yes.
we don't know if there's this exact representation, but it works. So, the easiest one is vaccine. Whether, we don't, I know that the immune system is much more complex than we think, but statistically, it seems that vaccine work much better than no vaccine. There's something like, seems like there's something like gravity, and whether the way we understand the world and physics and the space, whether it's exactly how it works, we don't know. But we do send probes in space. We do send them back. So something obviously is working. We do build buildings that have, 50 stories, 100 stories high, although some buildings are almost a kilometer high. So how do you distinguish between, what is our perception influenced by our society and where we are in society and who we are in society? How do you distinguish between this and things that some of the models that seem to be working and maybe challenging parts of these models are also dangerous, right? So again, one last example is geology seems to tell us that the Earth was not created in 7 days, 5,000 years ago. It seems pretty clear. And I'm not saying it's the only one, but so how do you distinguish between those two things, between being modest enough and humble enough to understand that what we understand is far from complete, it's complex, it might be influenced by who I am. On the other hand, there's things that I also need to base my society on if I want to move forward. Just the fact that genetics has shown us that we're so similar to each other that there's no point in making races and differences in human beings, which is a good thing for society. So I'm just wondering, how do you distinguish between the two?
That is an absolutely excellent question. It's one that I think about a lot and that bothers me quite a lot, and that keeps me up at night trying to answer it. And at some point, I'm going to have to write about it because it's a question that continues bothering me all the time. Okay. I believe in reality. I believe there is a reality. I refute it thus by kicking this desk right here. There's something hard here. And you can kick it too, and you can test whether or not I am actually kicking something physical. I think this is the way we begin to do this is I can say whatever I want, and people can say whatever they want. We can believe whatever we want. I'm going to allow people to believe whatever they want. But I think if you want to live in a society, and if you want to actually interact with other human beings in a civil way, you have to come to a sort of common understanding, and you have to look at other viewpoints, and you have to think about what we all sort of agree upon, and you have to sort of test your knowledge and your individual perspective against the world, against other ideas, against other ways of looking at the world. And I believe in electrons, even though I cannot see them, even though no one can see them, because essentially so many people for so long have found so much evidence that they work, and they can demonstrate it to me through essentially the jumping of oil drops in an experiment, through the electricity coursing through the walls in my home right now, through et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, through static discharges, through when my hair stands on end, when I touch something, through all of these different ways. The electron is not exactly how I imagine it. It can't be. It is my understanding of an electron is just my understanding of an electron. But our collective understanding of an electron, I think, sort of approaches something that is near to truth and near to the reality of what it is, near to what it physically is. As a representation, I think the multiplicity of viewpoints is what essentially gets at the truth and reality. Okay. Vaccines are obviously helpful and obviously are curing disease. And oh my gosh, measles outbreaks in Texas could be stopped. Um, so, um, and I think we need to get people to understand that science is not just knowledge itself, that it is rather a way of looking at the world that demands that we then go out into that world and see that something works according to the way we sort of perceive it. That is a mealy-mouthed way of saying that we need experiments, that we need to actually have ways of asking questions and coming up with pseudo answers that elicit more questions, and keep asking questions and keep testing what we think we know against what is actually out there, what we can all sort of agree is actually out there. People believe the earth is flat, but they still believe there's an earth, and they still believe that that we are on it. And I think we can all agree that there's an earth. I think they would even agree that there's an earth. I think that's some commonality of understanding, and then we can begin to ask questions of their belief and hopefully get them to ask questions too, to begin to I guess, put their beliefs against something firm, against what we all believe, the fact that there's an earth, and then we can begin to understand its properties and things like that. I wish that were simple. I wish it was just a matter of having a conversation with someone and sitting down and it's all about empathy and getting them to understand your perspective. And unfortunately, the world is more difficult than that, and people just want to yell their perspective. And Twitter or X or whatever it is has a lot of people to just yell their perspective and things like that. But I also I like the chorus, and I think the chorus can be a song, and it can be rather than just a cacophony. I think that we just need to start humming at the right notes, basically, and we need to I don't know, we just need to sing together. We can all yell, we can all have a voice, but let's sing together and make something beautiful and understand something beautiful and I guess experience something beautiful. All of my answers are going to be this mealy mouth, by the way. I get if you haven't already noticed. But I don't know, it's just the way I look at the world and think of the world, is that it's always something in between. It's in between our individual way of looking at the world and the communal. And I just want us to be able to accept all of it, basically.
Well, on this note, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was absolutely beautiful, Joshua. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. I think it spoke to our hearts and minds, really. It's exactly the kind of thing we discussed here at Building 21. So it was very enriching. Thank you so much. Thank you for your generosity also.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And I miss Montreal. I miss it so dearly. I can't wait to go back sometime. And if I do, I'll stop in, say hi.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.